Welcome to this session on shaping the future from foresight to action. So this is very much a session sort of about how to embed and mainstream foresight across really the institutions, across the way we do governance. And so to be clear also to my panelists, this is not so much about the why of foresight, but rather the how, because I think everyone in the room knows why we need it, but the how I think is really now very much a pressing issue, because we have a vice president designate for foresight, and you know, I've had the privilege of already having several conversations with him, and I think what he agrees with and is absolutely necessary is that this function of vice president of foresight is going to be, has to be more than just publishing a foresight report once a year. So there's a lot of thinking going on right now around how do you actually embed foresight, not just in one unit or so, but really across the institution, and help him to make it a success. And I think, you know, as I said yesterday, he is the right person for the job, because he is genuinely excited about it. And I think what he has understood is that embedding foresight is really, it's not necessarily a new way of policy making, even though I would argue that if you mainstream that it would be relatively new at the European level, but it's a better way of policy making. You may have seen the tweet that he put out yesterday, where he said essentially that foresight is not a luxury. He said, and I quote, "Foresight is a must. We need to be able to shape the transformative megatrends at work. It's either this or we become the victims of our future. That is simply unacceptable." So this is a tweet that Vice President Šefčovič put out. So I want to use this opportunity to have this session also to brainstorm a little bit and to speak to our excellent panel about what concretely should happen now, and what are sort of the ways of the house of foresight, and that you can share your experience with us. So let me first of all introduce my excellent panelists. It's to my left, yes, that's right, Mikko Dufva. He is a foresight specialist at the Finnish innovation fund, Sitra. You just headhunted another vice president of the European Commission, I assume you know. Then we have to my right, Leon Fuerth, founder and director for the Project on Forward Engagement, and you're, of course, also former national security advisor to then Vice President Al Gore. Okay. Why don't you say that? Because Sheila is here. She'll be happy.
That's right. And co-researcher with my friend and colleague, Dr. Sheila Ronis, on our current project, which is on foresight and democracy.
Sheila. This one is for you. So then we have to my far left, Oliver Gnad. He is a co-founder and managing director for the Büro für Zeitgeschehen. And to my far right, Bénédicte Rougé. She's the head of the Secretariat of the Foresight Delegation at the French Senate. So this is, by all accounts, a formidable panel with lots of relevant experience. So let me start with you, Leon. So, I mean, I think one of the issues we're grappling with is sort of sometimes this disconnect between policy planners and foresight specialists and politicians, who by nature tend to be sort of perhaps more driven by short-term interests. And I mean, what can one do to sort of bridge that gap? And I have to ask you to take this microphone, because as the moderator, I never let go of my microphone. So if we have an additional one here, by the way, I take that. It'll be on.
Okay. You told me to bring very short notes, and so I've reduced my notes to the... And I've also arranged with Sheila to give me 1-minute warnings, up to 60 minutes.
Can you do this for the others too, please?
All right. you know, there are volumes that I don't know about. There are volumes that I don't know about the internal operations of European institutions, so I will speak comparatively in terms of those I do know in the United States. With respect to the relationship between those who devote their minds and energy to thinking about the future and those who may or may not link their reputations and their careers to what these people tell them, we have the same problem. I've been to any number of conferences involving Foresight machers, and invariably the problem, in fact there's one of them right there, have the problem that they feel as if they're inside of a thick glass jar, banging on the walls to be noticed and heard by people who have the power to actually make policy. And they feel that they are inaudible. And the eternal question is, how can we connect with these people? And better yet, how can we make foresight a systemic element in the formation of policy? All right, so I'm going to run through some of the problems that we have, which I think are probably the same ones that you have looked at systemically. One of them is that foresight machers and politicians are entirely different animals. They have different psychologies. They don't think the same way, they don't talk the same way, and they don't understand each other in the same way. So there is a problem of arranging for better communication if you expect there to be something like a higher level and a more consistent level of adaptation. Next, they have different missions in life. The politician is interested in convincing public opinion and making policy, and among other things. The foresight macher is likely to be an introvert who is interested in the truth as best he can or she can find it. Two quite different approaches to what life is all about. They have different value sets, which are very important. The foresight macher is interested in finding the truth and in somehow living to say it applied in a sensible way to policy. The policy maker is interested, shall I say, in collecting scalps in the form of election victories or victories in disputes over policy. They have entirely different kinds of needs for support systems, and they each represent entirely different systems that do not understand each other typically, and so that creates another gap in communication. So then the question is, what can be done to bridge these gaps? I know, of course, but I've written it down. There are certain things that could be done to overcome the gaps in language, culture, and communication. One of them, I thought, what I recommended in what I was writing, based on personal experience, is a kind of brokerage function. I don't know where your politicians come from, but most of ours seem to come from law school. They have no idea of analytics or future studies, though they believe that they are capable of understanding anything at all at standard rates of pay within a very short period of time. The problem here is, I think, first of all, to educate incoming policy people in the capabilities, limitations, possibilities of the foresight-making network, so that they know what kind of questions can be answered, how to place those questions, where to get them, and how to go back with some. This is straight mechanics, but if you are a new person in a new office and you have no idea of the system that exists before you, you are floundering. So I think this is a matter of training and indoctrination and exposure. Next, I think that you need to have a panel which is comprised of foresight makers and experienced people who can sit down with policy people and basically exchange along the following lines. What is it you're going to try to do? Followed by, and here is the kind of information we think we can provide. And instead of guessing what the policymaker needs, come closer to a relationship which in English would be bespoke. That is, you order it up. And it comes to you pre-cut and it fits. You're not telling me the truth, Sheila. All right, next. How many of you have watched Star Trek in your early years? Aha. Then you remember the holodeck on Star Trek? This is an imaginary, or rather a virtual environment in which people can practice their reactions against virtual threats in scenarios. One of the things that Foresight can do is to expose policymakers to virtual situations and to test their reflexes. No such thing exists in the US government, although it might in the military, I'll take that back, but it's rather like the elaborate trainers that exist for airline pilots. And I suggest that systems be brought into existence to allow policymakers to train and in effect experiment in the mind with solutions to issues rather than to experiment on the street with them. So that, is a short set of possible responses to the gaps between these two cultures. Then, and here's my last point, not really, but it's going to have to be, you need a common sense of purpose and a common sense of organizational strategy. Those are clearly not present in the United States, and they are clearly not present here. In my opinion, the agreed goal between policymakers and consumers is to somehow convince each other that the short and long-term configurations of issues are interrelated and interactive, and both must be considered in conjunction with each other, or each will fail. And the one thing a politician doesn't want to do is fail. And so the one thing that the Foresight maker can offer is awareness of where the possibilities for failure may be. That is a real service to anybody who knows how their head is screwed on. Then comes the question of a general systems fix, and that takes us to my baby, which is anticipatory governance. One of the things that I learned in government at the executive level is that national security does not consist entirely of guns and bombs. It basically is the amalgamation of everything that makes a society stable, strong, and healthy. This means that one of the tasks of government is to be able to orchestrate its total resources in balance with a sense of what it takes to cultivate these values. In order to do that, the one thing that governance typically does not do, but needs to learn how to do, is it has to learn to act not after the fact, but before the fact. It's all well and good to know what are the issues that have to be resolved before you set a policy in place. But if you insist that the evidence for this be absolutely conclusive before you are willing to risk your political neck, what will happen is that the opportunity for action will have passed by the time the proof of it has arrived. And I will give you a single example of what that is, and then I'll be done. On climate change, folks, I have had over the years many, many conversations with scientists. Long before they were ready as a professional matter to state unequivocally that human beings were responsible for climate change, or that what they were seeing in the statistics represented unambiguous evidence of climate change. And the typical response from the scientists was, well, we'd like more evidence before we do that. And, how are you going to get it? Well, we'll need about another 10 years and $4 billion for more instruments and tests. Meanwhile, they will have spent the preceding hour going through the evidence, and the evidence says, act now or regret it later. Trouble is that it is too much to expect scientists to provide that level of certainty. It is not for scientists to draw those final conclusions. It is for political leadership to say, seen enough, time to act. We don't act now, we're going to regret it plenty later. And if it turns out that this was a false alarm, that's what I'm here to take the blame for. Those individuals are sort of hard to come by. But the one thing the Foresight maker can do is to help them feel that they have a handle on the factors that are contributing to the issues they must decide.
Those are excellent points. Thank you so much. I mean, maybe one of the things we can speak about, because I do think this is a conundrum, is the collective action problem. So even if we in Europe understand we need to take action, it strikes me that maybe we need sort of foresight activity around the globe so that you will have policymakers around the globe with the same degree of awareness on why they must act, because this is...
I looked at the script for this meeting, and you're not supposed to ask me that question.
Oh, okay, so... Okay, it was more a comment on your very excellent... excellent intervention. No, but one thing I will say, because I hope someone's taking note, and that we can also, maybe from my team, that we can pull together a couple of ideas. What you say, essentially, they don't speak the same language. I think that's right. I think that a lot of people sort of in the foresight community and policy planners speak not the same language that politicians speak. And this was, we had a discussion yesterday where essentially, I mean, one of the recommendations was what politicians don't want is that essentially the foresight experts add to the noise that they already have. I mean, because there is no shortage of information and trends and things they should act on. So I think one of the functions of a good foresight expert is, first of all, to really use a language that is accessible and not too abstract.
It is the responsibility of the potential political consumer to create a safe space in which that transaction can take place. The Foresight-macher has to believe that even if they bring something that the policymaker doesn't want to hear, it will be received with serious respect.
Yeah, that's another additional very important point, essentially, that you need the top-down support to essentially share perhaps information that the policymaker doesn't actually want to hear, you know. I mean, that is absolutely crucial, I would argue. So then we turn to Mikko, and Mikko, apparently you once wrote that in this turbulent world, trends analysis is not enough, and you therefore encourage sort of a degree of humility. But tell me, as a foresight expert, what concretely do you propose, and you know, how can we do this all better than we're currently doing? So you don't get my microphone. Don't try to grab it.
Perhaps I start with what I mean by turbulent world. We of course have heard about the VUCA world. I like the term post-normal times as well. That we are in such a not just complex times, but also times where there's lots of disagreements and conflicts and different viewpoints. So how to do foresight in these kind of times, and what's the role of foresight, and what's the role of foresight practitioner in these times? I've kind of learned the kind of trade in one way, doing trend analysis, scenarios, road mapping, etc. And I have had to come to the point that we always say that challenge your mindsets and think the unthinkable, but I have had to think the unthinkable and challenge my mindset as well. So the short answer how to do it is to have self-reflection and challenge your own mindsets. But I do have 3 points on how do I try to kind of move forward with foresight in these kind of turbulent or post-normal times. The first is I explore an entangled mess of rubber bands. The second is preferring campfires, and the third one is joint dreaming. I think I'll have to elaborate a bit on this. So yes, so the first one, exploring a tangled mess of rubber bands instead of drawing a map. So what I mean by this, we yesterday especially learned a lot about that we live in terms of in times of unpredictability, also in times of tensions, and so we need to look at these tensions in addition to trends, and that's why the metaphor of rubber bands. But it's not just one rubber band. it's a kind of a mess of a lot of different rubber bands, and I have to try to kind of grasp our way through that, and especially not adding to the noise, but trying to kind of contextualize all that noise, all of the kind of weak signals, all of the tensions. So not trying to make a even gloomer picture of the future, that there's these and these tensions, and but really to use the tensions as a way to increase understanding of the current situation. Also using weak signals not as kind of predictions or possible surprises only, but as a way to kind of broaden your range of futures and really getting to the unthinkable. The second one was campfire. I think we need to move from closed doors to campfire. We again heard about this yesterday, about radical inclusion and diversity. I'm really glad, for example, about the keynote by Pupul Bisht, or the work that the Next Generation Foresight Award winners are doing, and I definitely tend to learn from them, because I think the question of whose futures is important, but also kind of what are the images we use when we are kind of presenting the futures, who is included in those images, who is represented. But also where is foresight where does foresight happen? Does it happen in behind closed doors, or should we go outside and really not expect people to come to foresight, but for us to more to go to them? And this needs a kind of a humble attitude, listening, discussing about futures, discussing about utopias, but discussing about dystopias, and really kind of building the argument for dystopia also all the way to the end, and then what we'll do about that, as well as the utopias. Yesterday there was a couple of calls for more discussion of values. I think this is the kind of fruitful way to think, discuss values, to try to discuss values in terms of different images of futures. Then the third one, joint dreaming instead of reporting. Maros Sefcovic clearly said that we need to increase capabilities. I think this is very crucial. The shift to shift the focus from kind of reporting on the future to increasing the capabilities for each of us to think about futures. And I would say that a key thing that I'm also asking is that okay, who is my audience, and what is their understanding of foresight? Do they see that a foresight practitioner is like an oracle that will tell the future? Or is foresight seen more as kind of joint gardening, that there's lots of things that are planted and then something will probably grow? Or is it more of a power struggle, or even a labyrinth? Are we creating so many different structures of foresight that we can't kind of cope with them in the long term? This idea that we need capabilities, it's of course in practice could mean different tools. We have done that in Sitra quite a lot, to have tools in addition to our vision or megatrend work or weak signals work. But also to use different tools to enable the understanding. I like the holodeck metaphor as well, because I think we need experiential methods to bring futures to the present to be kind of experienced, and then have a discussion on, okay, was this preferred? What's good in this future, etc. And finally, on this capability, I think we need the capability also to imagine better futures, imagine utopias, not as something we will actually create, but something to aspire to and something to balance out the many dystopias we have. I think Fred Pollack said nicely in the Image of the Future book that we have the capability to dream finer dreams that we have ever dreamt before, and this has been something that's really been inspiring me lately. That we need to build the capabilities to dream finer dreams. That's
a nice way to wrap up. I mean, one of the points I wanted to pick up on is your metaphor about the rubber bands, where you say we need to contextualize noise. I mean, do you mean we have to help prioritize? I mean, we have to say you pay attention to this, maybe a little less to this. Do you mean we have to understand better the sort of the intersection of different trends? What exactly are you talking about? And very brief, in 30 seconds or less.
So it's about the connections between trends. When kind of two trends collide, there's a tension, and there's interesting stuff in future-oriented dialectics on what might happen next. So one of the trends might be dominant and absorb the other, or there might be a synthesis, or there might be they might stay in a kind of a tension and in a kind of parallax gap. So this is what I mean by tensions, to look at not just the trends, but also how they are connected. What are the key tensions between them? We have been talking about quite a lot of them, but I think this is a useful kind of tool to really contextualize, basically.
Excellent, thank you so much. Let me then turn to Oliver. So you're using Foresight to improve policy sort of on a daily basis, which is very much in line with what Leon, the phrase he coined on anticipatory governance. So being half German, I can say that usually Germany is not known as a leader in anticipatory governance. Yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit what you learned along the way, and sort of what you had to learn maybe the hard way, and maybe actually Germany is doing better than we give it credit for.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me. First of all, I have to say I'm not part of a governmental organization other than the three representatives and co-panelists here. I am a consultant working for the government, and kickstarted my work when the NIC Global Trends Report 2012 came out, which kickstarted ESPAS too, as I understand. And so it's thanks to Matthew Burrows, who is here in that audience, that Berlin got aware of the fact that they need to get ahead of the curve. Because in 2012, as we all know, we had 5 years of crisis already behind us. And this put into question the whole idea what role Germany would play in that world and how it can act better, not only as a nation state, which is a troublesome definition for Germans anyhow, but also within Europe. And so I accompanied this process from the very beginning when Thomas Bagger kickstarted it together with a small foundation in Berlin, which he used as a platform to learn about things. So he started discussing global trends in a very small group, which he then brought in when Steinmeier took office 2013 into the review process, as you all know. Let me go back to describe how difficult it is and why it is so difficult to do strategic thinking in Germany. And you know what I'm talking about. Yesterday, we had that already over dinner. 3 levels of why it is so difficult in Germany to do strategic analysis. One is the public mindset. It's the default system how Germany perceives itself in the world. We had our fair share of history in the 20th century. This is the notion we have. And when the wall came down and the Russian Empire crumbled, we perceived ourselves as already being there where other nations have to catch up, being a postmodern state, doing multilateral work for good, and letting loose the idea of power games in the real estate. So Francis Fukuyama's End of History very much resonates within Germany. And we thought we were on the right track, because 10 years after, NATO was enlarged, the European Union was enlarged, so everybody thought, and we remember the global strategy punchline of the EU, the EU has never been better off in 2003. And then we got hit hard many times, starting with 2008. Changing that conversation about what role Germany would have to play is not an easy endeavor. Since we were expected to shut up and calm down 50 years long, strategy was the prerogative of Washington, London, and Paris. So changing that mindset, this public mindset, is something very difficult to do, especially since we saw how other nations, particularly our lead nations, acted in the Middle East and didn't succeed. This is one observation. So the mental state of the public doesn't allow for a realist perspective of the world. The second one, and this is probably the even harder nut to crack, is how our government structure is working. And being a federalist state with a highly departmentalized government structure, with a very weak federal chancellery, other than perceived from the outside, they don't have the prerogative in policy making. It's with the ministry, so it's different than in the presidential system. So we basically have to tackle 14 ministries plus the chancellery to somehow get a common vision of the future and what are the threats we have to face. So one example where it went very well and where it's the most advanced system is the Foreign Office. I come to this in a minute. The third level is the individual level. And as a friend who's a Foreign Service officer once said, we are not expected to think beyond our pay grade. Which means the jurisdiction of your workplace is more important than challenging your superiors and the common wisdom of government and society. This changes very fast now, and as I said, the Foreign Office is probably the most advanced ministry in Germany, as they kickstarted the review process in 2014 and learned, by the way, from the Norwegians in doing that. And they came up, as you probably all know, with two different structures. And I think this could be also a model for the new commission and what you're doing, Anna, is. In the Foreign Office, they set up two entities. One was already existing, is the policy planning staff, who was always looking at the bigger picture, but more from a political perspective, not so much from a what is out there and might hit us soon, a strategic foresight capacity. This is being done not on a structural basis, but every once in a while. I come to an example later on. But after the review process in 2015, the Foreign Office got a new DG, the first time I think in 30 years, which is really exceptional, on stabilization and crisis prevention. And within that unit, and we have Mr. Schemel here, there is a foresight unit and an early warning unit. So what the Foreign Office does, this department for strategic foresight serves as a service unit within the ministry. It's a go-to station where sectoral and regional departments can get advice and methodologies and workshops and facilitation on topics which are pressing. For instance, the future of Kosovo. So what they do, they invite not only other ministries, representatives for other ministries, so this is the lateral work they're doing, but also think tankers from across the country and sometimes from abroad. So they open up that system. It's a lateral system from within. It's a bottom-up approach. The policy planning stuff goes more after the long-term perspectives. They're doing stuff with think tanks. One of the most impressive things I've been lucky to be involved with was a scenario workshop on 3 Americas after Trump. So they depicted scenarios of 5 different Americas, be it a return to a more rational republicanism, be it a more democratic rule, be it gridlock, because the Americans might be preoccupied with themselves. The outcome was sobering and annoying. It's whatever we do, it's going to be very costly for Germany on security and economic. So they reach out to the wider audience within society. This is what the policy planning stuff does. And the service unit, the Department S, is serving as a nodal structure within the foreign ministry and for other ministries too. So it is a cumbersome process, but it is functioning. And as we speak right now, the Federal Chancellery is staffing its Foresight unit. So, and I know a colleague is here since yesterday. So steadily, but it's growing, the federal government in Germany, with external help, gets a culture built which looks beyond daily politics. And I think this is going to last and this will not go away.
Excellent. I mean, that sounds very interesting. But can I ask a follow-up question? I mean, this Department for Strategic Foresight, it sits in the Foreign Ministry, but you says it serves also other ministries. But strictly speaking on foreign policy matters, or?
The department is a department of the Foreign Office. Yeah. It's within the DGS, stabilization, and it serves the Foreign Office first. It doesn't serve other ministries. It serves the Foreign Office, but the Foreign Office poses questions which interlink with other ministerial jurisdictions. Most importantly, when it comes to security issues with the Ministry of the Interior, when it comes to migration issues and security, with the Ministry of Economic Development and Cooperation, the human security effort. So it's a much wider community which they span right now than within the ministry alone.
Interesting. I mean, that is definitely worthwhile to look into. So thank you for sharing that. Let me then finally turn to Bénédicte. Yes, here's the microphone. So, I mean, to some, Foresight can have sort of a taste of central planning. And you, of course, work in a parliament, and I think no one could envision sort of a worse place for central planning than in Parliament. So, I mean, please tell us a little bit sort of how you see that, and also how you do foresight on a day-to-day basis in the Senate. Would be very interesting to hear. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, your question is interesting because about 25 years ago in the French Senate, there was a delegation for planning. And this, of course, is no more existing. And now we have a delegation for strategic foresight. And this is very, very special because very few parliaments have an organization, some kind of structure dealing with foresight. And of course, there is something here in the European Parliament. In Finland, there is something really special. It's called the Committee for Future. And it's a standing committee, and this is really the only parliament in the world which has a committee dedicated to future. And then in the French Senate, we have this delegation for foresight, strategic foresight. It doesn't exist in the National Assembly. So this delegation is made of 36 senators representing all political parties. And they can expect no political gain from this participation. It is really interest, pure interest about future, about foresight, because I would say that maybe a minority of them has strong convictions about foresight and they know what it is, but most of them don't, especially when they arrive in the Senate. But they want to take a little time every week to think about the future, meet people who are dealing with foresight. So there is a specificity of the French system is that everything which is done in this delegation is under the responsibility of 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 senators. So it means that all the debates, all the briefings, all the notes, everything which is done within this delegation is under the responsibility of MPs, senators. And it is very important because, in fact, we have noticed for a long time now that MPs usually believe maybe more their fellow MPs than experts. And very often experts write very good reports, but they are not read by MPs. And these MPs who meet, of course, many experts to elaborate their reports, have a specific language, and they are, how can I say, they have some kind of something value, another value for their fellow MPs. And what you were saying about problem of communication between politicians and experts, this is the way we deal with this problem. And also, we have now, for the last 5-6 years, possibility of putting some of our reports in the plenary of the Senate. Because every month there are 2 or 3 days dedicated to MPs' initiative. So it can be legislation, of course, but it can be also debates. And for instance, 2 weeks ago, we had a debate on our, one of our latest reports on climate change. I will speak about this report in a few seconds. But so we had a very interesting debate in the plenary with everyone about this Foresight report. Because this report was about the necessity to address adaptation to climate change, and the idea was to make something very, very, very practical. So it was dealing with climate change in 2050 and sometimes 2100 also. And it was, the idea was to show consequences for the daily life of French citizens. So it was agriculture, wine production, water, level of rivers, snow in the mountains, the level of the sea and oceans, etc., etc. The buildings also, and everything in a very, very practical way. And we had a very interesting debate, and the minister was there to answer also the senators. And so this is one way of introducing Foresight work within the parliamentary work. But also we are trying to anticipate some legislative debates. For instance, a few months ago there was a legislative bill on mobility. And 2 or 3 months ahead, the delegation made a report about mobility in 2050 and trying to feel what would be the emerging technologies, but also the what people would want to do, in especially young people, and not only in the urban areas, but also in very rural areas, or also in the mountain regions. And so there was a very long work done on this. There were 5 MPs worked on this, and they met probably 100 or 150 experts, and they traveled in different places around France to visit the people, to meet startups, to meet people, and to try to find out what would be interesting to do in this field. And this has led to some amendments to the law on mobility. But we also do some works which are less directly related to some legislation. For instance, last spring we had a long work on the relations between generations, and this has led to many interrogations, and now some MPs want to go a little bit more in depth in some of the issues which we had seen at this occasion. So this is, in a few words, the way this delegation works in the French
Excellent.
Senate.
Thank you so much. I mean, that sounds absolutely like a best practice. Just a very short follow-up question. I mean, you mentioned 36 senators. How are they chosen? I mean, because they have an interest in the future, or they express an interest, or how do you decide who's going to be in it?
Well, first, each political group has a number of senators, and then it's
they decide. Yeah.
they choose. It's mostly senators who are interested.
So can I ask you something? Is this a different formation than, let's say, other groups that deal with other issues? Are these more innovative people, or more interested, or?
No,
Okay.
not especially. No, not always. No.
Okay. I mean, that's very clear. That's that's very clear. Thank you.